Evening to all of you. It's morning here, as Darren has said, but it's Friday morning. So I'm exactly 12 hours ahead of you. Thank you for inviting me to this session. I was just getting to know what the National Farmers Union is about. So I feel honored to speak to this group today. 50 minutes normally is not given to any speaker, so I'm deeply grateful. The long road to COP26 will take us from 1992 to 2021. So we have the history, and we will be witnessing a major, a COP that is set out to be another historic moment, but we will see how historic that will be given the history that we will see. Next slide, please. So we all know that climate change is a global problem. Hence, a global problem needs a multilateral solution. And remember 1992, for many of us, including me, we were part of the Rio generation, the Earth Summit that took place in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, which actually gave birth to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Because the world recognized that there was the historic emissions of developed countries was contributing to global warming, and therefore we do need to respond. And in 1997 was born the Kyoto Protocol, and as we know, the Kyoto Protocol was inadequate in terms of limiting emissions, and in fact, the Canadian government walked out. After the Kyoto Protocol was ratified, they walked out sometime in the 2026, well, before Paris, they walked out of the Kyoto Protocol. So there are many milestones. I won't go through all of them because I will be dealing with them in the course of the presentation. Next slide, please. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is very important, because the Kyoto Protocol, which is the daughter, and the Paris Agreement, which is also the other daughter, all of them are supposed to enhance what we call the implementation of the Framework Convention. So the objective was actually to stabilize greenhouse gases at levels that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Anthropogenic basically means human-induced interference. It would allow ecosystems to adapt, ensure food production is not threatened, and enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Because we are talking about constraining the development depending on fossil fuels. The rich world became rich during the Industrial Revolution, emitting so much of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so developing countries were being constrained as they saw it. So how do you balance between the rich and the poor world in a way that would ensure that you manage to address climate change, and at the same time do not constrain developing countries to meet their obligations to provide basic needs, food, address poverty, and so on and so forth. But the very fundamental principle of the convention is actually equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This we have to remember because it's still very relevant, although the developed world believes that it's no longer relevant. But for us, from the developing world in the global south, this is absolutely critical. Although the climate change problem is common, the responsibility is differentiated, and that's really key, and that developed countries must take the lead. Next, please. So the CBDR principle, as we call it, the common but differentiated responsibility, basically it's about equity between countries. Now, and if you look at the little image on the right-hand side, you will see there's a difference between being treated equally, and there's a difference in understanding what equity means. So equity is basically ensuring that those who are disadvantaged and who are not privileged are given the same kind of access and the same kind of what you call it, they have the same ability to take part and to engage, and on a substantive basis that the disadvantaged actually are privileged. So the equity principle recognized that the major contribution to pollution, including greenhouse gases and resource depletion, was by developed countries, and that developing countries are now disadvantaged because there is little environmental space, including the carbon space or the carbon budget, and which has led to implications for their future development. We will talk about the carbon budget later on, as I explain. And the developed countries must take the lead in taking action and must assist developing countries through the provision of the means to implement their actions so that equity is realized. So we don't want the developed world to repeat the same kind of model of production and consumption patterns. We want that to change, but that change can happen with a lot of means of implementation. If that doesn't come through, as we will see in the coming slides, there will be a lot of difficulty, because there will not be a just transition to the kind of low carbon pathway that we want to pursue. Next, please. So the Framework Convention also says that the commitments to act include mitigation and adaptation. This is for all parties. Article 4.3 says that the developed countries provide new and additional finance. They say new and additional finance, very key words to developing countries. We will talk about this new and additional later as well. And it also recognizes that the extent to which developing countries can effectively implement their commitments will depend on the effective implementation by developed countries of their commitments. If we were negotiating an agreement today, you will not get these kinds of provisions, because today it's very, the world is even, we are not talking about multilateral cooperation. It's really about competition and combat. And so this principle, these principles and these equity provisions cannot be repeated. And you will see what the developed world tried to do in Paris, trying to actually dump or ditch or reframe the convention, which they were stopped from doing. Next, please. So as I said, we had the Kyoto Protocol, and you look at the first commitment period, very little, yeah, when they at least 5% below 1990 levels between 2008 and 2012. This is minuscule. So, and there was they also introduced the emissions trading scheme. This particularly took off in Europe. And the reason why that was introduced was largely because of the US push, because they were trying to push a market type of mechanism to enable those who, what you call it, the large emitters, to be able to buy credits from those who are not emitting as much, so that they could offset. And this will become even more important now as we move to the COP, because of the international carbon trading regime, which is being pushed. Then there was also this clean development mechanism, and that's also important in the context of the Article 6 discussions that are taking place under COP26. The clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol was actually to enable the developed world to be able to implement their emissions reductions by financing developing countries to do the carbon reductions for them. And this was in a way offset. So what the developed world couldn't do, they say that it would be cheaper to mitigate in developing countries, so they would pay developing countries to offset their emissions. So whatever emission reductions are done in the developing world will be counted as emissions reductions of the developed world because of the payment of the finance or by that investment. And that was in the world when developing countries did not have obligations themselves to have emission reductions, which is different, which is changed now under the Paris Agreement. So this was the first commitment period. And as we all know, after the Kyoto Protocol was ratified, the United States refused to ratify and they left. So this was the problem. They created a weak agreement and then they walked out, and they did the same for the Paris Agreement. And then we were in Bali in 2007, a very important moment, because the world decided that since the US was out of the Kyoto Protocol, they needed to be brought in. And because China and India and what is termed as the larger emitters and the developing world were not taking on emission reductions targets, so the Bali Action Plan was actually a way of getting everybody on board. And so there was a timetable drawn up to actually draft a new agreement, and that actually there was the Paris Agreement. The 2 years became a long negotiating process. And they were also supposed to negotiate the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, which is from 2019 to 2020. So this was the quid pro quo between the developed world and the developing world. So the developing world said, we are willing to come on board in terms of emission reduction targets if you do the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And as we know, the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol only was ratified in December 2020, when it ought to have come into existence in 2013. So the Paris Agreement kicked off, but not the Kyoto 2. And then there was this Copenhagen Accord, the famous Copenhagen Accord, which actually led to a collapse of the talks for very, very unfair, untransparent way of negotiating. We will come to that also. Next, please. Then we had because of the collapse in Copenhagen, when parties convened again in Cancun, Mexico in 2020, there was this attempt to say that multilateralism still continues. And so the Cancun Agreement was heralded as, oh, we saved the multilateral process. But basically what it did was to take elements of the Copenhagen Accord which we will see what some of those elements were. So the main thing was limiting the temperature rise to 2 degrees at that time. This was what they talked about. The 1.5 was only under the Paris Agreement in terms of pursuing the limitation of the temperature goal to 1.5, economy-wide targets for the developed world, and nationally appropriate mitigation actions for the developing countries. Actually, it was voluntary more than an obligation for developing countries, and then some promise of fast start finance and long-term finance. And then there was the Durban Platform, another process which actually led to the Paris Agreement and the Doha Gateway, where the Kyoto 2 was agreed to. And so parties agreed that emission cuts of at least 18% below 1990 levels, and to revisit the commitments by the end of 2014 to raise the ambition level. It was after this that Canada left and said, we don't want to be a party anymore, because in the Kyoto 2, there was actually the aggregate level that was needed to be, was set by at the top, an aggregate 18% reduction below 1990 levels. And because the Canadians and others followed the United States and said, nobody can tell us how much to reduce by. We can't agree to any top-down way of deciding what the target should be. And so until now, there was, well, in 2014, they did not revisit the ambition, nor did the ratification happen until the end of December 2020. So the slide is not correct there on the ratification, because it should have said that ratified in 2020 December. Next slide, please. Then we had the Lima call to climate action. The talks in Lima 1 year before the Paris Agreement almost collapsed, but it was saved. And what was important was actually the inclusion of loss and damage in the Lima decision. Also important was the scope of the Paris Agreement. And also there was this new concept which was born there, the intended nationally determined contributions. So what the developed world tried to do was to get countries to already indicate what their intended nationally determined contributions would be. That means basically their climate action would mean, and they were more interested in a mitigation target rather than adaptation and loss and damage, or even the means of implementation. So the scope was actually mitigation centric, and that was a problem. And so there was a lot of effort also to undermine differentiation between developed and developing countries. Basically, the developed world wanted to replace the convention. And so in 2015, there was the negotiation text, which was huge, and then the Paris Agreement. Next, please. I'll speed up a little bit. So, you know, big hands and huge jubilation. Next slide. And the purpose of the agreement was basically very important, as you can see how it was delicate, very delicate balance between different parties, yeah, which was very difficult to do. So the developing countries ensured that the Paris Agreement is to enhance the UNFCCC's implementation, not to replace it. Because if you replace it, you would lose the link to historical responsibility, because the developed world, particularly the United States, did not want to ensure any recognition for historical emissions, nor did they agree with the equity principle. And then the temperature rise, a lot of the small island states, and including Bolivia and others from the ALBA, they were pushing the 1.5 degree centigrade goal. So what we landed on was well below 2 degrees, but to pursue efforts to limit to 1.5. The reason why this was very delicate was also because if under a 2 degree, limit, the carbon budget is larger. Under a 1.5 degree world, the carbon budget is much lesser, because as you know, we are already, the temperature has increased to 1.1 degree centigrade already compared to pre-industrial levels. So we don't have much time. So in terms of reaching 1.5. And so the transformation that needs to happen is absolutely dramatic. It's an emergency. Many people have called this an emergency. So under a 1.5 degree world, you already only have about 500 gigatons of carbon space left. And this was said by the latest IPCC report, the first physical sciences report, which was just released about a month ago. And so they said 500 gigatons of carbon space left, and we are emitting something like 42 gigatons every year, which means that the remaining carbon space would be exhausted within a decade. So this is phenomenal. So this is why there's a big worry. If you have a 2 degree limit, the budget is about 2,000 plus gigatons. 1.5, 500. So a large space there. So this is why you have this range. And then increasing the ability to adapt to adverse impacts, foster climate resilience, and low GHG emissions development in a manner that does not threaten food production. Now, as farmers, you all know how important food is. And this is really a critical piece of for developing countries. How do you ensure that the responses and the ability to transform the world does not threaten food production? And in fact, this is very key for all over the world, but particularly in the developing world, in view of poverty and hunger and so on. And make climate finance flows consistent with low emissions pathway and climate resilience. And this other implements the Paris Agreement to reflect equity and CBDRRC. And this was a new addition in light of different national circumstances. This came out of the US-China discussion before in Lima itself. And this is how they came up with this in light of different national circumstances. China interprets it one way, the US interprets it in another way, but the long and short of it all is developing countries keep insisting that the equity and CBDR principle is still intact. And that's really critical. Next, please. So I'll speed up more here. This is what the Cancun encapsulated here. So instead of the Kyoto top-down kind of system where aggregate targets are set and then it's countries have to meet that aggregate target. Here, it's bottom up. Countries pledge what they want to do. So you can do what you want, how much you want, and that is the only thing that is required. But what the developing world managed to do was to prevent the Paris Agreement from being mitigation centric. So this term NDC is not mitigation. So Article 3 says that as NDCs to global response to climate change, all parties have to undertake and communicate ambitious efforts covering mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology transfer, capacity building, and they will follow a transparency framework in terms of reporting and measuring and so on and so forth, with the view to achieving the purpose of the Paris Agreement. So this is important because it's not mitigation centric. And then there is also an understanding that there's an effort to reflect progression over time, recognizing the need to support developing countries for effective implementation. And the first MDC is to be communicated no later than the party ratifies the Paris Agreement. And the NDC timeframes range from largely most countries forwarded a 10-year timeframe. That means from 2021 to 2030. And only the United States and the Marshall Islands then had a 5-year timeframe. And so in COP26, there is a important discussion of whether the next time frame, that is from 2030 and 31 onwards, should it be a 5-year time frame common for all, or a 10-year time frame common for all? So that's going to be a big discussion. Next, please. So Article 4, it uses the term NDCs and also mitigation. So what it basically says that, and this is important, parties aim to reach global peaking of emissions as soon as possible. This will take longer for developing countries, and to undertake rapid reductions so as to balance between emissions and sinks in the second half of the century in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. This is very key because this is where this whole net zero is coming from. You will hear everywhere about net zero and all countries being urged to do net zero. But this is not what the Paris Agreement says. The Paris Agreement, balancing between the emissions by sources and removals by sinks, which is sinks are actually your forests, your grasslands, your wetlands, everything that would sequester the carbon. Now, that is a global aspiration by mid-century, and they interpret that to be 2050. So it's not about every country. It doesn't prescribe that every country undertakes a net zero target. And this is where we have a problem, because if you have a 500 gigaton carbon space left, and the reason why you only have 500 gigatons of carbon space is because the developed world has occupied or taken up much of the carbon space. So think of it very much like in terms of land, like the war between Israel and Palestine. Yeah, you have limited land space, and there the Israelis keep expanding and expanding and expanding their occupation. So what the Palestinians have is very little space left. So this is what it means in terms of a carbon space. So when you have US taking a net zero by 2050, Canada, I don't know, I didn't look at your Canadian target, but the UK talking about a 2050 target, that is delaying action, doing too little, too late. They can't be using up the remaining carbon space anymore. They are supposed to peak and actually do rapid emission reductions. And that's why many of us say that they must get to real zero. In fact, they should have gone negative with not through dangerous technologies, but rather that they, a lot of sequestering through increasing of sinks and so on. But instead, they're talking about delayed action 2050. So I'll come to this again just to remind you that this is going to be one of the biggest problems in COP26, because the United Kingdom is pushing everybody to that, coming down from the UN as well, all aspects of all parts of the UN, which civil society groups have critiqued it, social, environmental justice groups and the climate justice groups. We have gotten together and we have said, this is a massive problem because net zero by 2050 for all countries is unjust, unfair, immoral. And so we have to remember that. And then, and the other part of the Article 4, each party shall prepare and communicate and maintain successive NDCs it intends to achieve. Now, intends to achieve is very important. Not that it's going to achieve, it intends to achieve. That's because of the United States. United States said that we will not have any agreement which says that we must achieve what we agreed to do. And now this is ridiculous. First, you do a bottom up, you can pledge anything, and it can even be unfair, not based on what is a fair share of taking into account historical emissions and so on. And yet you only intend to achieve, that's what is measured. So this is ridiculous. Next, please. Next slide. And then the differentiation between mitigation between developed and developing countries. Developed countries are supposed to take economy-wide absolute reduction targets. Developing countries should enhance mitigation efforts because they have different types of NDCs. And something is having a problem. Oh no, okay. I was reading the chat. Now, support shall be provided to developing countries, enhance support for enhanced action. Very important. And then the developing countries are encouraged to move over time towards economy-wide emission reduction or limitation targets. And for LDCs, the least developed countries in the small island developing states, they may prepare and communicate strategies, plans, and actions for low emissions development, taking into account their special circumstances. Next, please. Then there is Article 5 on forests, and this is very important. You have two types of action. Forests, both for conservation and for enhancing, but also looking at forests, not just from a mitigation lens, but also an adaptation lens. So you have this results-based payments, which is payments that are paid after a country is done, shows that it has sequestered the carbon, whereas joint mitigation and adaptation approaches, that actually means, money upfront, not results-based, but upfront to do what they have to do in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Next, please. Then we come to Article 6, the cooperative approaches, and this is key in COP26 because the rules for the Article 6 have not been met. I mean, since after Paris and until now, there have been very much difficulty in coming up with the rules, because what exactly is this animal called cooperative approaches? So huge, different viewpoints. Basically, it's about parties choosing to pursue voluntary cooperation. It's voluntary. So it's between parties, between governments, yeah? So the Article 6.2 mechanism, it refers to the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So you won't see the term carbon markets in the Article 6 at all. But many say that this is what it means. ITMOS is sounds like a mosquito, I always say, yeah? Internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, which is basically about transferring mitigation outcomes, which is like carbon trading. And this is in Article 6.2. And the idea here is to implement the NDCs, right? So so this is being hotly debated as to what exactly it will look like. And then the mitigation mechanism and support sustainable development. This is the Article 6.4. This is the Clean Development Mechanism Plus that was under Kyoto, which was actually advanced by Brazil. The idea here is a mechanism to actually help each other in terms of sustainable development and ensuring the implementation of NDCs. So what is said in Article 6.4 is that the mechanism cannot be double counted, meaning if a country, it means no offsets basically. So if a country is financing a particular investment or a project in a developing world, not no offsets. Offsets are allowed, but you cannot double count or double claim. So whatever financing which is given, you cannot count it as financing and carbon emission reduction. You have to say if you have to choose which it is. And if the host country and the country which actually bought the credits both cannot report that they have reduced emissions. So no double counting, no double claiming. And that's what is there. But this double counting is not there in the ITMOs. So parties are now talking about how that also has to apply to Article 6.2, and also the notion of environmental integrity. How do you make sure you really have environmental integrity in the system? And then the non-market-based approaches, this was actually forwarded by Bolivia and the ALBA countries as an alternative. And they said that the convention and the Paris Agreement is not about market and trading, it's about non-market-based approaches. And they have got a very good proposal on how non-market-based approaches can be expanded. So the big fight is whether Article 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8 will be balanced in terms of the outcome. Because what the developed world wants is they don't care about the 6.8. All they want is the 6.2 mainly and the 6.4, and the rest the 6.8 is not their priority. So there's a big pushback in making sure that there is a balanced outcome. Next, please. Adaptation, very important. And here, the global goal on adaptation, this is one of the agreements, decisions that was taken in that this would be a global goal. So you don't have just a temperature target, but you also have a global goal for adaptation in enhancing the adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, reducing vulnerability, and so on and so forth. But what's not been articulated is how do you actually, elaborate the global goal? And this is something that the developing countries have been pushing, a global goal on adaptation, because what they don't want, again, is a mitigation-centric temperature goal without looking at whether we actually have enabled more people to benefit from adaptation, that more climate resilience has been built, more communities have been assisted. So very, very key for the developing world. Next, please. Very key new pillar. It's called the loss and damage pillar. The United States until today is still resisting looking at loss and damage as separate from adaptation. They always wanted to link it to adaptation, because what they did not want is for a new, another mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage would mean new implications of finance for them. So this is where there's going to be a big fight in COP26, because developing countries are talking about financing also for loss and damage. And there is a Warsaw mechanism that was a Warsaw mechanism on loss and damage, which was basically a way to ensure that the developing world can actually have a mechanism which is implementable. Now, again, in Madrid, what the outcome of that was a Santiago framework, an expert group to actually help in identifying, and needs, and some expert group to make sure that the Warsaw mechanism becomes actually something with teeth and can be used by developing countries in terms of real implementation. And so, because developing countries recognize that there's only so much that you can adapt to, and loss and damage is becoming more and more critical. And we are expecting the next IPCC report on adaptation and vulnerability and so on to show that with all this climate impacts at the moment, with all the forest fires that Canada and others and drought and massive droughts and extreme events that have been happening, we are going to be seeing more loss and damage. So an entire economy can be wiped out because of loss and damage. And this is going to be a political hot potato in terms of the finance issue. So the only way Article 8 came to be is because if you look at the last paragraph here, the United States negotiated on the sideline with 1 or 2 island countries. So here, when we come to the finance, very, very key piece, and I will show you why this is, for me, I think that, and for the developing world, this is going to be the most important discussion in COP26 in Glasgow. So in Paris, they agreed that the developed countries shall provide financial resources to developed countries for both mitigation and adaptation. So the obligation is a shall obligation, which means it's mandatory. And then other parties encouraged to provide voluntarily, because the developed world was pushing in Paris to get other countries to also contribute to climate finance. But the developing world has said that the obligation is actually for the developed world due to its historical responsibility, and we can do so voluntarily, but we are not obligated to provide the finance. So it's about finance being a climate debt that has to be repaid, and that's what the understanding of developing countries is. And then the developed countries to take the lead in mobilizing. So this term mobilizing is to allow climate finance from a wide variety of sources, instruments, and noting significant role of public funds. So it's always talking about how you can get the private sector to get engaged and involved, scaled up resources and so on, aiming to balance between mitigation and adaptation. Very important. I won't go through all the other details, but later on, I mean, if you have more questions, we can engage, but I'll unpack a little bit more on finance later. Next, please. Technology transfer. This is one of the weakest outcomes in Glasgow, in Paris, insofar as I understand it, because it's about long-term vision is shared on the importance of realizing technology development and transfer. That's like a motherhood statement, yeah? Parties shall strengthen cooperative action. So it's not strengthen cooperative action, but not about developed countries and shall provide technology transfer. That language did not get in there, because the whole fight here is about who will actually have the technology. And even the whole discussion around whether intellectual property rights on technology is a problem, because developing countries were saying a lot of the technologies, including the solar and wind and so on, renewable energies, they are patents on these technologies. And so if these technologies are expensive, and if this means that we have to buy them and pay for them and so on, this is not what global cooperation and technology transfer is. So the word IPRs was also not allowed in any decision in under the Framework Convention, and even now when they discuss this. So because intellectual property rights is a term that, I mean, is banned unofficially, yeah, by the developed world. So they all gang up and they say we cannot talk about IPRs because it's our proprietary right. So the same discussion that you have in the trade in intellectual property rights in the WTO on the COVID vaccine, where you have seen the apartheid in terms of vaccine access because of the monopoly that is in the hands of the big pharma. Similar here, monopoly in the hands of the big powers, so that instead of looking at it as a global good that requires a global response, that means that you do not monopolize the technology, and then make sure that technology is actually diffused and transferred. And this is still a huge obstacle despite so many years of the convention. Next, please. So transparency framework, they agreed that there would be an enhanced transparency framework. It's basically about how to measure, verify, and report what countries have done. And then how do you review it, and so on and so forth. So there was a big discussion now about common templates. So you will hear this at COP26 about whether there should be common tables, a common framework, or blah, blah, blah. But basically it's about increasing the transparency. But developing countries have said that, look, there is a lot of capacity that is needed actually to develop all the reporting ability and in being able to undertake all the detailed kinds of reports. So they say that we must have the flexibility, and we should not be able to be tasked to do the same kind of reporting as the developed world. And so that flexibility is something that developing countries maintain to manage under this transparency framework. And that will be what they will be discussing in terms of how do you operationalize it in real terms. Next slide. Article 14 is the global stocktake, another very important key issue, because the architecture of the Paris Agreement is that you have the NDs, nationally determined contributions, that countries will do, communicate every 5 years, and there would be a global stocktake every 5 years of the collective progress of everything, not just the meeting the mitigation goals, but also to look at how they have done in terms of adaptation, and also to look at the progress on the means of implementation. And now there's also an effort to look at how the global community has addressed loss and damage as well. Another big fight of whether loss and damage is part of the global stocktake. But anyway, the global stocktake is a comprehensive global stocktake. The developed world is always still trying to only look at mitigation. They don't want to look at all the others. So that fight will continue. And the first global stocktake is supposed to take place in 2023. And what they are discussing now is all the inputs that will go in doing this global stocktake. Next, please. Last point on the Paris Agreement, implementation and compliance. So there is a committee that is supposed to look at how countries are implementing and complying with the Paris Agreement. The developing countries said that it should be compliance for developed world, and developing a little bit more facilitative, but the United States and said, no. All of us it should be not be punitive, it should be facilitative, non-intrusive, blah, blah, all the caveats to make sure that nobody is going to review what they are doing in a way that will make them comply. So it's much more facilitative than it is a compliance regime. Next, please. So basically, just to show you the history of the broken promises from all this time, the failure to deliver emission reductions. I will go to the next slide. Shifting goalposts all the time. So next slide, please. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, because all I want to show you is that the Annex 1, which is the developed countries in the convention, Annex 1 parties on aggregate achieved only 13% emission reductions between 1990 and 2018. This is from the UNFCCC Secretariat website itself. And countries in Western Europe, US, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada have not managed to reduce their aggregate emissions between 1990 and 2020. And instead, their aggregate emissions slightly increased. Now, this is totally outrageous. And until today, emissions are slightly increased. It's crazy. Next, please. So the failure to deliver the finance goal, this was agreed to in Cancun, this 100 billion per year, 100 billion per year by 2020. This is something that you will hear again, very important in COP26. So there's a promise from Copenhagen, which collapsed in 2009, where Hillary Clinton plucked out from the hat this 100 billion. It wasn't based on any needs assessment, but 100 billion per year mobilized. In Paris, this goalpost was shifted to 2025, and they continue to fail achieving this promised finance goal. And there is a reluctance to agree on the definition of climate finance, so that you can count loans which countries have to repay back, which are not hugely concessional. Even that is called climate finance, which is unfair. Next, please. So the battle, oh, sorry, that was a bit fast. Okay, good. I'm glad that it's fine. I just want, the scale of the challenge for developing countries. The UNCTAD has estimated that because of the COVID pandemic and the response to that, the delivering on the ambitions for both the Agenda 2030, which is the Sustainable Development Goals achievement, and the Paris Agreement due to the pandemic, will require unprecedented global cooperation. And what they have estimated is at least investments amounting to a minimum of 2% of global GDP annually for the next few decades. This is what is needed. Yeah. Next, please.
We've got about 4 minutes left, Meena.
Okay, I'm almost done. So I've spoken a lot about. So skip this one because this is a runaway goal. And then we will hear about the developed world saying that they have come up to at least 80 billion in climate finance. Next slide. But Oxfam and others have shown that this is not so. It's much less. It's actually around 19 to 22 billion or so. So it's really a numbers game. Next, please. And then the MDB Finance also, it's all a numbers game. Next, please. And I've also talked about the need for definition of climate finance. Next, please. And the developing country needs, and this to basically show about the trillions that are needed, including for adaptation, the billions that are needed for adaptation. You can look at the numbers here. There is also a new report that will come out. I have not seen the latest numbers, but it's around this region. The NDCs of developing countries talked about 5.7 to 5.8 trillion by 2030. Next, please. Only to say, no, next we can skip this, the GCF and so on, can skip this as well. So the issue is money is available, but what is lacking is political will. Next, please. I just want to show that even in response to the COVID pandemic, Western European countries alone allocated close to 4 trillion and almost 30, this is almost 30 times larger than the Global Marshall Plan, which was a response after the World War. So you can see where there's, and where there's a will, there's a way. And there is the 87 billion fossil fuel subsidies that G7 countries said that they will remove. But we need to see that happen, and that would free that amount of money that they can do in terms of contributing to the developing world. Next, please. Also special drawing rights, and IMF announced it, $650 billion. But this is not for climate finance. They had said they approved the allocation for the climate, for the global liquidity and economic response and so on, only to show that but this 650 billion goes according to allocation by who contributes to the IMF. So this is also unjust. And you can see that the UN Secretary General has actually said that allocation is going to those who don't need it. And so what really has to happen, that this has to change. Next, please. But there is this special drawing rights possibility. So the most important thing for me is that COP26 must be about real ambition on finance. You will hear a lot about real ambition on mitigation, but none of that can happen without real ambition on finance. Next, please. And then adaptation. I've already discussed some of these, so we can skip about what COP26 got to deal with in terms of adaptation. Next, please. And loss and damage also, I have explained what the challenges are, what we can expect in terms of that. And finally, if you need more resources, you can go to the website of Third World Network. And this book is a very useful book for everyone, because it traces the history of the negotiations and what we call the clash of paradigms. The final thing I wanted to say is that this nature-based solution, net zero nature-based carbon markets, this is what they all want. And this we call carbon colonialism. The whole emphasis on nature-based solutions is for carbon offsetting and to implement the so-called net zero as if that's going to save the world. So net zero will not save the world. This is actually the biggest fraud as we see it, a big con as we call it, that's being unleashed. And we don't have enough nature to accommodate all the offsets that countries want to continue to pollute, believing that the trees will sequester everything. Not possible. Thank you very much.